Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Learn with Jason. Today on the show, we have Mark Erickson, as well as, I believe, the rest of the core maintainers. We've got Ben Durrant and Lenz Tronic. So let me bring them up to the stage. Welcome, everybody. How are you?
Hi, doing pretty good.
I'm super happy to have you all here. This is also fun for me because typically we only do the one guest on the show. So having this more panel style discussion, I think, is going to be a blast. We already had good discussion going in the YouTube chat before we even went live. So I am really looking forward to this one. So I guess let me just start by doing a quick round of introduction. So Mark, you've been on the show before, but why don't you kick us off? For folks who aren't familiar with your work, do you want to give us a bit of background?
Sure. So my name is Mark Erickson. My day job is working at replay.io, where we're building a time-traveling debugger for JavaScript. Jason actually had me on the show last year to get to talk about that and show it off. And I've been working on Redux since the middle of 2016. I've done a lot of work on, I created Redux Toolkit. I've done a lot of our documentation. I've done the last several versions of React Redux. I've basically had my hands in all of it for about almost 8 years now.
Very cool. Lenz, how about you?
Yeah, hi. My name is Lenz Tronic. I'm joining from Germany, so I'm probably a little bit delayed sometimes. Sorry for that. I work full-time as a maintainer of Apollo client, which is since 1 year my day job. And I'm on the Redux team since 2019, so for almost 5 years now. I've been doing a lot of work on Redux Toolkit, and I'm the creator of RTK query.
Very, very cool. Ben?
Hello. I'm Ben. My day job, I've recently joined a procurement company called Market Dojo, and in my free time, I joined the maintainer team for Redux in March of last year. So I'm the new face, but I wrote a lot of features for the 2.0, so it was really exciting to get that out.
Yeah. I think this is also literally Ben's first appearance in public anywhere. So a bit of a coming out party here.
Excellent. And so is this, how big is the Redux core maintainer team? Is this everybody? Are there other core maintainers?
This is effectively it as far as active maintainers. There are a few other folks who are involved in some fashion or in some of the discussions. Tim Dorr is kind of the other, I guess, original maintainer. So quick history lesson, because that's what I do. Dan Abramov and Andrew Clark created Redux in the summer of 2015. Dan got hired by Facebook to work on React in late 2015. I got involved in contributing to the Redux docs in early 2016. And by summer of that year, Dan was busy at Facebook working on React. So he messaged me and another guy named Tim Dorr, who had also been involved with React Router, and told me and Tim that, here's the keys, have fun, this project is yours. So Tim has been involved for a number of years. He's a little bit more of a kind of sit in the background and it's just kind of maintain things kind of a guy. There's Nathan Birama, who has been the maintainer of the Redux dev tools for the last few years. Let's see. Matt Sikowski has done some work around RTK query, including some of the docs and examples. Let's see. Anybody else I'm forgetting?
Shraxi has done a lot.
Yep. A couple other users. Who have contributed a number of docs and tweaks and examples, and that there's been lots of other folks who have done contributions over the years, but these are kind of the folks who are, I guess, semi-consistently involved.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in Reselect right now, but the two of you have more contact there, so.
Yeah, there's another user named Arya who started contributing to the Reselect library a lot about 4 or 5 months ago, and actually did a lot of the stuff that came out with Reselect version 5.
Yeah, and I've been recently working closely with Aria on updating Redux templates and so on, so that's been really good.
Very, very cool. So the last time, let's see, we talked about Redux when we did the Redux Toolkit episode, which I think is the all-time leader for views on my channel. That one has been wildly popular because I think people have a lot of Redux in production and a lot of questions about what the right way to do it is. I think you came back later to talk about Redux again, and I'm very excited because today, or I guess recently, you have is 2.0 out or is it almost out?
Oh, it's out. It's
out.
I hit the button on that the morning of December 4th.
Great.
Literally right before running off to the airport, which was both a brilliant and a stupid idea.
And he does it every time. Like, it's always release at the airport, fix the wrong releases in the plane.
There's always something.
Excellent.
Well, I mean, like one of the truisms I've learned about maintaining a library over the years is that it does not matter how many alphas and betas and release candidates you put out. You will only start to get real meaningful feedback after you release the final version, because only a handful of people are going to try out the pre-releases.
Mm-hmm.
And that limits the number of scenarios that people are going to run into. And so, once it's actually live, more people are installing it, and there's more different usage scenarios going on. And now you find out about all the things that you missed during the development process.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think you also do that reverse psychology thing. You know, like if you're waiting for 2 hours for the food in the restaurant, the moment you go to the restroom, the food comes. It's like the same with bugs. The moment you're somewhere in the jungle and have a totally shitty internet connection, that's the moment people find a bug and report it. So you just do the release and you get on a plane and the bugs come in. Like if you did the release, then we would not get the bugs for like 3 weeks if you wouldn't go into that plane. So
yeah. So for let's actually kind of talk about the development timeline a little bit. So we shipped Redux Toolkit 1.9 in, I think, October of last year. Oh, I guess October of 2022. And actually, let's go back even further. Redux Core came out in 2015.
Right.
Redux Toolkit 1.0 came out in October 2019, 4 years later. If you do the math, it's now been over 8 years since Redux came out. That means that Redux Toolkit has been out half as long as the original Redux Core. And yet a lot of people still don't even know it exists. But we had been on RTK 1.x minor releases for its whole lifetime. Mm-hmm. We had added lots of new features and functionality, but we were also limited by most of the original build setup and most of the original tooling constraints. And that included that we effectively still treated IE11 as a valid usage target. So we had to backwards compile all of the build artifacts to ES5 so that they would work in IE11. We were still using, like, the package contained artifacts. Like there was both CommonJS and ESM files in there, but the way that they were defined meant that a lot of times the build tools wouldn't pick up the ESM files, or they wouldn't work in all environments, especially under Node with the modern Node ES module configuration. So it worked, but it didn't work as well in all environments as we wanted to. So what really started this process was we wanted to modernize the build packaging. We wanted to drop IE11 compatibility. We wanted to properly update the packaging configuration so that more environments like Node would correctly pick up ES modules as the default. We wanted to shrink bundle sizes. We had accumulated a number of options that we were ready to deprecate and remove, and we had a number of new features that we wanted to add. So I began working on the packaging setup at the start of this year, and frankly, it was something that I had been dreading for the last couple of years.
I will say that any time that I have to deal with like CommonJS to ESM to backward compatibility, usually what I do is make an excuse to not do that work.
I approve of that approach. Yes. So I'd seen how hard it was. I'd accumulated like a couple hundred bookmarks of articles about how to try approach configuring this, and I knew it was going to be hard. And then I dove into it, and I found out this is actually a lot harder and more complicated and stupider than I thought it was going to be. And my first attempts didn't work out. Various tools started throwing errors with the packaging changes. I had to back off and try to create a set of example applications that would run in our own CI on every published job so that I could test the build packaging against different versions of Create React App and Vite and Next and Node to hope that it was working in all those environments. Slowly got something that I thought worked in most cases. And like every time I thought I had things configured right, there was another tool, another environment, another edge case that didn't cooperate. I actually ended up writing a blog post in August that was both an info dump and a set of gripes about just how hard this whole process was. And I actually did not expect many people to read that article or actually have any interest in it. And it turns out that basically every other library maintainer I've talked to has said, oh yeah, I've run into these same problems. I identify with this. Thank you for sharing your own experiences.
I ran into them today, honestly. Like, it's horrible. It's just horrible.
It's a rough it is a rough transitional period, it feels like, where I think we've well, actually, you know what? I was about to say something that I don't know is true. I feel like we've largely decided that we should consolidate on one standard, but then as I was saying that, I was like, I don't think that's true. I think there are people who are like, absolutely not, CommonJS for life.
One of the things that I linked in my blog post was a pair of dueling articles. The Dino project put out a post, I guess probably in July last year, where they said CommonJS is killing the JavaScript ecosystem. And a day or two later, Jared Sumner, the creator of the Bun runtime, put up a response to that, where he said, no, actually, number one, CommonJS is not going away. It's too embedded everywhere. And number two, there's actually differences in runtime loading speed and usage scenarios where CommonJS can be superior to ESM. And both of those had valid points, but I mean, like it's not a clear cut ESM is always the right choice, always use it everywhere kind of an upgrade scenario. Like there are actually real technical trade-offs involved.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of that's the game is you never get to just be like 100% right as a maintainer. You're always going to break somebody's setup. There's the whole XKCD comic about that. But so let's talk a little bit about I guess as leveling let's reset expectations for anybody who's not super familiar with Redux. So Redux itself, state management, originally targeted at React exclusively. It's no longer React exclusively, right? You can.
It's never been React exclusive.
Interesting. Okay.
So Redux has always been UI agnostic. The actual Redux library and Redux Toolkit by itself actually know nothing about React. They are plain JavaScript, and they can run anywhere JavaScript executes, in a browser, under Node, other bizarre JavaScript environments, which is why you've always had to install at least two packages, the Redux core and the React Redux adapter library, which allows your React components to talk to a Redux store. Redux has and is being used with other frameworks. I've seen it used with Angular and like old Angular, current Angular, Ember, Vue, jQuery, etc. We certainly expect that the vast majority of our users are using it with React.
Right.
But the core truly is UI agnostic, and we've been very careful to make sure that we preserve that as a valid way to use it.
Got it. So Redux itself, the original implementation, I used it would have been 2016. And what I felt and what I've seen is sort of the general consensus around Redux is that it's very powerful and it also has no rules. And because it has no rules, it has led to everybody. And I think that's sort of like, I get the sense that's sort of a core React team ethos is like, we don't make rules, we just give you primitives and you can go do whatever you want. And I think that has been in the Redux community, it seems like that has been a bit of a source of frustration is like, we do it this way because this is what we saw recommended by Dan, or this is what we saw recommended by somebody else that we respect. But those start to branch and diverge, and then you end up with funks and sagas and all these additional like Redux ecosystem things that can make it really difficult to understand like what is Redux versus what is Redux ecosystem and what's the right thing to do. Am I making a good choice? Is this maintainable? And I think all of that is what led to Redux Toolkit. Am I correct in that assumption?
Fun fact, if you go to NPM today and you search for Redux, you will get around 13,500 packages that all contain the word Redux in some way. And most of those are before Redux Toolkit. So the point that Redux Toolkit came out, people still started writing their wrapper abstractions, but it slowed down massively. And I think I haven't updated this number. It was 13,000 like 5 years ago. Now it's probably like 13,500. But those first years were wild, and everybody had their own little abstraction.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I remember one of the big questions I had when I first started using Redux is I remember looking at it and it was like, okay, this isn't actually a library. This is like a pattern. Right. And I remember, okay, so I guess I'll write a package that implements this pattern for our project. And I think I didn't publish it, but yeah, I had my own implementation of Redux in the project I was working on. And it really is kind of fascinating how like empowering that can be to developers who like to be at the, really up to the elbows in the source code. But for the vast majority of us, we just want to get work done. And I think that was, why Redux Toolkit, for those of us who have used it, feels like such a breath of fresh air. And so at a high level, what is Redux Toolkit doing that is different from Redux original flavor?
Yeah, so I a little bit more background on that kind of spectrum of abstraction stuff. As you said, the original Redux core was incredibly tiny. Dan wrote a shrunk down version that was Redux in 100 lines. You can actually write a valid working Redux store in about 25 lines of code, and there's even an example of that in the documentation. And so it is a pattern with a whole lot of assumptions about the right way to use it that are not enforced by the original source code. And so because it was designed to be so much like plug in your own behavior to begin with, that's why, like you said, you had all the different people in the ecosystem building their own little abstraction libraries and pieces on top of it. And on the one hand, that was great because we had this whole big explosion of add-ons and tools and side effects libraries and everything else. But it also meant that every Redux app looked very, very different.
Yeah.
And over the years, we saw many of the same complaints and concerns, and many ecosystem packages that were solving the same kinds of problems over and over, and maybe solving them in similar ways. And of course, the number one complaint about Redux over the years was boilerplate. Why do I have to have actions/todos.js and reducers/todos.js and constant/todos.js and const add_to-do equals quote add_to-do and all this stuff? And part of the answer is you didn't have to have those. Those
Right.
were conventions, but they were admittedly conventions that were shown in the docs. And even when you started doing your own abstractions, there was still a lot of that extra kind of boilerplate code that was common to write.
Mhm.
So we invented RTK to solve a few problems. One was that we wanted to give users a consistent way to use Redux. We wanted to eliminate as much of that boilerplate as possible. And we wanted to build in tools and patterns that solved most of the situations that people were using Redux for, and basically remove the need to have most of those hundreds and thousands of ecosystem add-ons. So we were able to learn from the kinds of problems that people were running into and the solutions they had come up with, and build kind of like best practices, built-in approaches from what the ecosystem had developed over time.
Got it.
And that's essentially also like the development that you see if you look at Redux Toolkit in general. The first version of Redux Toolkit attacked that first big problem. That I have that reducer I have to write, I have that action creator I have to write, and I have that action type that I have to write. And the action type is always going to be a string, and the action creator 99% of the time is a function that takes one argument and creates one object, and that could be automated. And then I have the reducer, and it has a lot of handwritten update logic in it. And what the first version of Redux Toolkit did, it was like, it gave people create slice, which implicitly internally did the action creator thing and the action type thing, and it added immer into it, so you could just mutate states. So that already shrunk your code a lot. And on the other hand, you got configure store, which gave you a starting setup with configured middleware and dev tools. So you didn't have that question in the first moment, oh, now I have to pick middleware for my project, but you could just go with what we gave you. And in most projects, it was already enough. And if you needed to add something, you could still add it, like if you had your favorite middleware thing, but you didn't need to. You had a starting point. And after that, we shipped that, we waited half a year, we looked at what people had really as their next big problem, and that was like handling of asynchronous logic, because that repeated itself again and again and again. And people always had this like starting action and this pending, this finished action and this error action, and handling the three cases and everything. And we gave people thunks, so the point was we ship an abstraction over that. We ship a thunk to you that does these things in a sensible way, because it was very easy to get bugs into there. So as a result, create async thunk was born. Then we noticed that people were working a lot with lists and inserting into lists and filtering lists and doing all of that kind of stuff. So Mark swiped the entity adapters from NGRX, it's called, I think.
Yep. The Angular version of Redux.
Yep. Like we've been looking at other libraries a lot. I don't know, like the next thing was the listener middleware, I think, which essentially is
RTK query came out
Really?
in 1.6, so that was you.
Oh, that's the next one.
The listener middleware was 1.8. So later on.
That was like there was the time when on Twitter all the people were writing, haha, I deleted 10 million lines of Redux code because now I have React query. And we were like, oh, people have that much code for the abstract logic. We should do something about that.
Right.
So we got that data fetching library in there. And it took a lot of inspiration also from other libraries like Apollo, like Urkel, or the tag and validation system is essentially what Urkel does with type names. There's inspiration from SWR. There are some things like the structural sharing that React Query does. So all kinds of stuff there. Then there was that other big middleware that is out there, which is Redux Saga, which is really cool, but extremely complicated. And most of the you're bringing a truck to a bike race if you use Saga. Like it's almost always not the right tool for the job, and it's almost always too powerful and too big. So we got the listener middleware in there, which does, if you don't need action channels, which is like the only feature I can think of that's not an RTK in the listener middleware, then the listener middleware is like so much less code. You don't need to learn what those generator functions
or yield star or
right. Like all that weird new syntax you don't really need to use
specialized syntax.
And that's like the next big thing that came in. And at that point, the work for 2.0 started, and that's probably more the story that Mark and Ben can tell, because I've been watching that mostly from the sidelines.
Yeah, so I guess to frame that 2.0 question, what are like the big improvements, or I guess what makes it a major release?
Breaking changes. Yeah. So I mean, like that literally is the starting point. So
right.
The JavaScript ecosystem uses semantic versioning for packages, and so it's major.minor.patch. If it's a tiny little tweak, it's a .x patch release. If it's a new feature, some kind of internal improvement that doesn't break user code, it's a .x minor release. And if it's got breaking changes, which is ambiguously defined, then it's a major release. And one of the things I'd been told early on was that any change to the package artifact definitions, like adding the exports field to your package.json file, would be considered a breaking change, because that could alter how people's build tools interpret loading the library.
Yeah, I mean, it has definitely been a common issue for me, is that somebody will do something like that in a minor, not realizing that the next time I update my packages, everything blows up, and then I end up having to do the archaeology to figure out what just happened. Why is this package that I haven't changed breaking on a minor? And it turns out that CommonJS, EJS, exports fields, like all that stuff is a chaos monkey in a project.
Yeah, which is why I was putting off working on that. So that was the first big set of changes we wanted to make. We also had a number of deprecated options we wanted to remove. And those were the initial set of breaking changes. And we also ended up making a number of types changes as well.
Got it. Okay.
Lenz?
I just wanted to throw in the question, like, which big features do you have in a major release? It would be best if we wouldn't ask that. Like, the thing about a minor release is, in a minor you get the feature. In a major, if people do the major right, you get nothing new. You don't get any goodies, and because we're just breaking things, and that's why we give you the major. But in reality, people expect that if you get a major, you get so much more than a minor, that we can't go out and not put any new features into a major. So there are going to be some in there. But in a perfect world, people would just be like, oh, a major, I have to read the change log and adjust my code, and then be, oh, a minor, I get new features. But that's not where we are.
I think in our case... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ben.
I think in our case, there were some features that were made possible by doing breaking changes. So we had started making breaking changes, and then actually, as a result of those, we could then add a new entry point for React-specific features in the core for Redux Toolkits, rather than anything specific for query. So by doing those breaking changes, we were then allowing ourselves to make even more cool stuff.
Got it.
And a lot of the complexity around doing a release like this is, like, I'm a developer. I've led project teams at work before, of various sizes, but a lot of doing this was me essentially putting on a project manager hat and deciding, like, what are we trying to do? What are our goals? What is the scope of this release? And trying to drive us forward to get this out the door. And in fact, one of the biggest keys to even having gotten this out by December, RTK query has gotten a ton of adoption. I don't have hard numbers on it, but I can tell you that anecdotally, a very large percentage of our usage questions in the React Flux chat channels and the issues that are filed in our repo, both bug complaints and feature requests and how do I do this questions, are about RTK query at this point. So clearly the Redux using community has eagerly adopted RTK query. And we have literally probably at least 100 to 150 open issues with requests about features and bug reports, plus a few specific threads that have gotten hundreds of comments asking for tweaks and changes. And one of my concerns as we got into September and October, into September really, was that some of these requests were going to have to involve breaking changes to RTK query, except that we had not yet even had a chance to comb through the issues, make a list of what individual things people were requesting for RTK query, have discussions about what we wanted to do, figure out which of these could be a breaking change and which ones could maybe wait until later. And like part of the issue was it's been 4 years and we're just now releasing our first new major version. It could be another 3 or 4 years until we do another major version. So we have to cram in as many breaking changes as possible now, otherwise they'll never get out. But like I could just see this giant undefined size and scope shape looming over us. And it was scaring me. And I was like, it's going to take us at least another year to get the RTK query stuff done. And that'll delay the release of this. And it's just going to be hanging out there the entire time. And finally, in late September, I was actually sitting in a plane on my way to a work trip. And inspiration struck me. And I messaged Ben and Lenz and I said, what if we just cut scope and we defer everything about RTK query until after 2.0? And if it's small features, fine, they can go in 2.x minor releases. And if it's breaking changes, we can be willing to do an RTK 3.0, maybe late next year, that would have breaking changes just for RTK query. But like in the interest of actually shipping this, let's just cut scope and defer all the RTK query changes. They said yes. And at that point, now there was a relatively finite list of remaining work that needed to be done. Of course, that list grew, but it was a relatively small list of remaining things left. And number one, I could feel the weight being lifted off my shoulders and my brain. And number two, now I could focus in and say, okay, let's fix these remaining issues, make these tweaks, do these docs updates, and now we can drive towards the finish line and actually get this out the door.
Gotcha.
So playing project manager was tough.
I do think that, I mean, that is always a pretty unique challenge when you know what's possible and then you have to decide what's practical. And those are usually pretty painful decisions because, you know, there's a lot that we could do, but there's never enough time to do it all. So, okay, I saw a question come in early on, and I want to make sure that we've got some time to actually write some code today. So let me get this question up from Mateus. Is Redux Toolkit able to handle large amounts of data sent from various WebSockets channels?
Why not?
I
that's probably the first question that I would have. Essentially, a Redux store is a variable in your memory. And if you could have an array in your normal memory, then you can also have an array in your Redux Toolkit store, there might be something like every modification to that array will be an immutable copy of that array. And if you do that like 10,000 times a second, that might get slow. So it depends maybe a little bit on like how much traffic you get into the WebSocket channel, but it's like a few updates a second. And if you have like only like 10,000 or 100,000 items in there, that's perfectly fine.
Got it.
Yeah, the size of the data is not so much an issue because an array inside your Redux state is the same amount of memory as an array in a random random JavaScript variable. There's the performance constraints of how many actions are you dispatching, how frequently and how close together are you dispatching them, how many subscribed components are there, how complex is your selector logic. It's the amount of update code that has to execute. There's no hard numbers there. Obviously, if you're dispatching hundreds of actions a second, that might be kind of overwhelming things. So, but there's nothing inherent that makes it not able to do work.
Got it. Okay. Another question came in that this is probably a really topical question. Is Redux RTK compatible with React server components?
Lenz?
Yeah, that's my question.
With such enthusiasm in your voice.
I love it.
I've been answering that so often. Okay, so the thing about React Server Components is that React Server Components are stateless. And the thing about Redux is that Redux is a state management library. So all you would have inside of a React Server component would always be your initial state. And that's something that you probably don't want to have. And even if you were starting to manipulate that state, you would manipulate to that state, you would like pull out your HTML, and the next request you would start again at the initial state, because you should not get that state to grow, because if that state would grow, it would grow with all the users you had on your server, and you would mix data from different users, which is probably really not what you want. Then there's the other side, and that's the side of client components in React Server Components, and where you draw the line between those two. And for me and in my eyes, React Server Components are great for data that doesn't change a lot. Like that you render out a static HTML, because you know that during the lifetime of your application, you don't want to make that round trip to the server, or you don't need a round trip to the server because that's not going to change anyways. So if you're in like a web shop, it would be the product information, the product picture, all of that. But if down there would be a comment section, that's much more dynamic, and that has to refresh it a few times. And that's something that I would solve for the client component. And that's where, at that point, putting in Redux totally makes sense for client state in general, where also something like an data fetching library like RTK query still totally makes sense, because you still have those interactions with some kind of API, just with more dynamic content. What's important there is that you draw the distinction that you don't have server data that's also part of the client data, because like if you have something like a card count or something that was rendered out as part of a React Server component, when your client stuff updates, that won't update. Like it would go out of sync. So you have, for each type of data, you would have to decide, is it server-side data or is it client-side data when you want to keep it. And then you get to the big problem in the room when you have made all of those decisions, and that's server-side rendering of client components. Because every client component that you write, and that you write on the assumption that it's going to run in a browser, has to run for the first page load on the server. And the worst case is that you do something like data fetching in a client component that renders on the server, and then you render it in the browser, and it doesn't get that state over, and it has to do that same request again, and you have to do all of that again. So essentially, what we need is a way to transport data from like that accumulates during that server-side render into the browser. And there is currently no good way of doing that in general with React. Like, there's no data fetching library out there that can do that SSR and reuse the data immediately without a lot of hacks. And those hacks at this point in time always go around and they use Next.js internals and not APIs that are provided by React, because React just doesn't provide these APIs that we would need. So at this point, we are waiting for these primitives to drop. I have experimented, like I've patched React, I've added my own primitives, and everything works. But it's probably not what the React team is going to add, because they always have like a super complex plan for 200 years and before. And I don't have that plan, and I don't have those insights. So theoretically, it's possible to patch React to make it work, to do all of that. Right now, you have to fall back on fallbacks or like Next.js internals that are originally there to do stuff like transporting over CSS. And we don't want that. Like, if we add support for streaming SSR, which is essentially that missing piece, then we want to do that with React-specific APIs, and we don't want a React Redux Next package and a React Redux Remix package and a React Redux Redwood package. But we want a React Redux package that's capable of doing that. And that's why you don't see that right now. Because even if each of those frameworks will give us an API to work with that, it will always be a different API, and we will have to ship a different package. And nobody wins if we play that game. We wait for the React team. We expect the React team to ship a version 19 of React soon, whatever that means for the React team. And we expect a minor after that to contain one of those primitives, or React 20, but I'm more hoping for a React 19.2 or something like that.
Got it. Okay, great. So I could probably ask questions for the remainder of our time, but I think it would be fun. Let's build an RTK project, right? So let me take us over into this view here. And so before I get started, let me do a quick shout out. Thank you to our sponsors, Netlify and Vetsu Code, who have made captioning possible. We've got Ashley here from White Coat Captioning. The captions are available at this link that's been scrolling on the bottom of the page. I'm still working on how to get those into multi-streaming. I don't know how it works, but someday we'll get this to work. That then takes us to, we're talking about Redux, so let me drop a few links into the chat. Here is the Redux site. And then we are talking to Mark, and I'm going to drop GitHub profiles today because social media is a nightmare. So here's Mark's, here is Ben, and here is Lenz, all on GitHub. And where should I start? Like, if I want to spin up a new project and I want to do it's 2024, you're building a React project, you want to use Redux for state management, what's the right way to build a project today?
Well, the inevitable first question that I see popping up still every day on Twitter and React and Redux and Reddit is, what tool am I using? Am I using Vite or Next or Remix or whatever? For sake of simplicity, let's go with Vite. And if you actually click on our Getting Started link up there in the header, we should have our current installation and setup instructions. I believe somewhere in here should point to a Vite template, and there, in that the first line in that code block right there should be a line that you can copy paste.
Got it. Okay.
So the npx dgit redux.js.
Got it. All right. Let me open up a new Actually, we'll just go up a layer here. Then we'll do one of these, and I'm going to call it
RTK 2.0.
RTK 2.0. Can you do a dot? You know what?
Sure.
Let's do that.
Nice.
Real fancy. And then once we're in here.
Now the first caveat is that the template that we're cloning right now is actually still going to reference RTK 1.9. We have some PRs open that will update all of our templates to 2.0. So we'll have to do a little hand tweaking to get into, update the packages, but the core contents are still going to be basically the same.
Okay, so let me open up this package.
Yeah, there shouldn't be much in that template that suffers from breaking changes, for example.
Okay, gotcha. Just init this real quick so that we can see what's going on. All right, so let me make everything just a little bit bigger because I think it is probably too small to read. And okay, so I have my project, and this is a Vite project.
Yep.
It's got RTK, React Redux, the React core packages, and then it looks like testing stuff, type stuff, Vite itself, ESLint, JSDOM, Prettier, TypeScript, and Vite stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
So not a lot. Like, this doesn't have that daunting feel of like, oh God, I've got 15 packages that make this function. This is pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing we can do, and this should be a relatively small set of tweaks to update the packages, change the Redux the Redux Toolkit version to just like caret 2.
Okay.
And the React Redux version to caret 9.
Okay.
Yep. And so if we go install those, fingers crossed.
Okay, looks like it all did what we expected.
All right, we can try running this and see if there's any obvious complaints.
All right, and
all right, that's always a good first sign.
Nice.
Here we go.
Yeah, which actually right there, that speaks to a lot of what our goal was for 2.0. Like, if you look at the migration page, and we can look at that in a few minutes, it's a mile long. There are a lot of total changes. There are a lot of things that could be considered breaking changes. But at the same time, a lot of our goal was that many projects ought to just be able to bump the versions, and in many cases, things would still just work. Of course, that's not going to be true for every project. And I actually tried out upgrading some complex React Redux projects that I found on GitHub. But like, the goal is that even though the list of changes is long, in many cases, it just works ideally.
Yeah, I mean, this is so I'm sending a link here through just to show kind of what the changes are, and you're right that like this feels like a lot, but it also feels like this is, to your credit, y'all are one of the most thorough maintenance teams that I've seen, and verbose in a good way.
I have seen a number of people complain that we actually have literally too much documentation, and that can become confusing. And I'm sympathetic to that. We actually have 3 different doc sites because there are 3 primary libraries: the core, RTK, and React Redux, each with their own repository. I've tossed around the idea of trying to merge them sometime, but that would be a lot of work. So not doing that one anytime soon. I would rather err on the side of having too much information than having not enough information.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of always one of the classic challenges is how do you draw the line between like need to know and don't need to know? And I've always leaned the same way. Like it's better to have the information available than to make somebody ask for it. But then that information design is hard. How do you make sure that people discover what they need when they need it? That's literally an entire field of studies.
It is. I'm sure you've talked to Rachel Neighbors before. She is very passionate about the design of information and documentation.
Yes, absolutely.
So if we scroll down slightly here, there in the doc page, let's actually briefly talk about like a couple of these major changes here. So the see if you like there at the bottom of the intro section, I believe it calls out a couple of the areas.
Oh, so I was looking at kind of the headlines here. Do you want me to go to a specific?
Yeah, so like the right there. So
gotcha.
Yeah, like of all the changes that are listed as possibly breaking, we think these 3 are the ones that are most likely to cause potential issues for folks.
Gotcha.
So the first one is that when we first, let's talk about the object syntax for a bit. So if you click on that subsection. So when we first released RTK, the initial alphas were still in plain JavaScript. It got converted to TypeScript partway through the development process. And, we talked about how everyone was creating their own Redux add-ons over the years.
Right.
And, original handwritten Redux reducers always had a switch statement, and you switched on action.type, and you have, case, add to do, and so on. And one of the first things that everybody in the ecosystem did was they wrote a little utility that let you pass in an object where the action type strings like add to do were the keys, and the values were the little case reducer functions that would handle updates for that specific action. Everybody had one of those. There was even a copy-paste example of how to write one of those in the Redux docs. And so when we created Redux Toolkit, the create reducer function was a variation of that, and then create slice, the extra reducers field, was a variation of that. And one way we tried to simplify things slightly, create slice generates these action creator functions for you. And one of the funny little quirks of ES6 object syntax is that when you use brackets for the key, you can have any kind of a JavaScript expression in there. It could be like 1 + 3 or something. And whatever values are in there will get stringified. And if you pass in, I don't know, a function, an object, something, the JavaScript interpreter will automatically call .toString on whatever that value is. So we actually made these action creator functions, like to do added, have a toString method that returned the action type, like to do's / to do added. And that way you could actually use this function as the key, and it would just sort of magically get converted to the string. And that was a really cute trick early on. Unfortunately, TypeScript hates that because it doesn't know that this implicit to string call is happening. It just sees, wait, you're trying to pass a function here. Why are you doing that? You can't do that. It's not allowed. So,
as usual, TypeScript is the thief of joy. Continue.
Indeed. So in order to make it work, you would actually have, like with TypeScript, you would have to say like to do added .type, because we also attached the string as a .type field on the function instance itself. So that works, but then you run into another problem. The if you look at the action field in the reducer, TypeScript has no idea what that variable contains. So it sees that action is there. It doesn't know what the action.payload field is. It doesn't know in this case that it would be a to-do object. There's no way for TypeScript to make that association. So this is actually not type safe at all. So Lenz later came in and added an alternate syntax to create reducer and to the create slice.extra reducers field that is more of like a builder pattern. So you get an object with like a builder.addCase method in it. It takes that action creator function as an argument, and it can extract the TypeScript types of the action object, so that by the time you're writing the reducer, TypeScript does know what the TS type is, and it connects all the dots for you.
Right. And so let me quickly clarify. I was making fun of TypeScript, but I love TypeScript and I use it all the time. And this pattern is great because one of the reasons that I love TypeScript is because I always want that autocomplete. I always want the helpful reminder of like, hey, you're trying to call something that doesn't exist on this object, right? And so having something in the library that does that for me, instead of saying, if I want this to work, I need to manually create my types, and I need my types to be like passed in with the, my favorite version of TypeScript is the version that I don't have to write. It's the version that's actually built into the libraries through clever inference and other kind of, here's a generic, we'll give you your types back kind of thing. And that type of TypeScript is what makes programming in JavaScript feel like magic. When I have to start manually messing with my types, that's when I start to feel like maybe I'm getting in my own way with TypeScript. So I'm very happy to see this change. I think this is a pretty positive change.
Yeah.
So,
one of the goals we've had very commonly is, with Redux Toolkit is you annotate as few types as possible, essentially.
Yes.
Everything's built, so we rewrite crazy types, so you don't have to.
Yeah. I started the tradition, and Ben has kept adding more and more.
I'm happily
crazy types.
adopting it.
No, this is like, honestly, this is why there are so many reasons that people should be nicer to open source maintainers, but truly the amount of effort put into wrestling TypeScript so that I out in user land can do whatever I want and it just works when I plug it into your library. I've seen what that TypeScript looks like, and everybody should just be buying you dinner like all the time.
It's happened.
I don't know. Is it okay if I plug another show on here?
Go for it.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Mark and I were recently on an episode of Michigan TypeScript, which you can find on YouTube. And we showcased those types. So if you want to break your brain, these are 1.5 hours that will break your brain. And I'm sorry, again, my internet connection is horrible, so the live stream there is chopped up at some points, but it should still be very entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
All good. Yeah, let me get this up on the screen here for a second for anybody who wants to screenshot that and copy paste it out of your photos, because that works on computers now. Way to go, technology. Okay, so this is awesome. So let me get back to the migration docs. Did you want to cover any of the other pieces here?
So what changed here is that up through RTK 1.9, both of these syntaxes on screen were valid. We had updated the docs maybe about a year ago to say that we preferred and recommended the second approach, the builder syntax. But both of them still work. Starting in RTK 1.9, we actually added a development mode warning so that if you are using the older object syntax, it will print one warning per app that says, by the way, this will be removed in 2.0. And so in 2.0, we removed the object syntax, and now the builder syntax is the only way to use those fields. We did actually put out a code mod that will automatically convert existing code from the object syntax to the builder syntax.
Beautiful. So, and here are the code mods. Let me copy this link and drop it in here for anybody who wants to get at that. Just throw it up on the screen again.
The other thing with the builder syntax is that it's actually more flexible because it supports more patterns than just matching against the types. So as well as add case, which does the same thing as have the whole object syntax matching against a specific type, there's also add matcher, which takes a type predicate. So that could be any function that receives the action and tells TypeScript what that action looks like, and then it can respond to that with your reducer. And then there's also add default case, which if none of your other reducers recognize this action, then run this default case, essentially.
Got it.
Yeah. So overall, the object syntax piece is probably the biggest thing that's likely to cause issues with the migration process in terms of literal breaking changes to the code. But if you look at it, it's the same number of lines, maybe a handful of extra characters, but it's not like this is a really, really complicated set of changes to existing code.
There's a question that is the builder pattern tree shakeable?
Neither of them is tree shakeable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so neither option is.
In both cases, you build one big object, and one object can never be tree shaken or split up into many large, small objects. You build one big blob, it's not tree shakeable.
Okay.
Of course, if you build like other module boundaries, those can tree shake, but within one call of create slice, nothing could ever tree shake, and it's literally impossible that it ever will be able to.
Although on that note, maybe now would be a good time to talk about one of the interesting new features that would be added. And this would be Ben's specialty. So Redux has always had a function called combine reducers. And the standard Redux pattern is that technically at the end of the day, there is one giant reducer function that handles updating all of the state for every action. But for purposes of maintainability, we break that one big function up into individual smaller functions called slice reducers based on the pieces of your state. So if the top level pieces of your state for a blogging app are state.posts, state.users, state.comments, then you would have a posts slice, comments slice, users slice. Each of those has its own slice reducer, and each of those updates its own state in isolation. Like as far as it knows, there's nothing else to update at all. And then you combine those together with a little helper function that merges those into the one parent object. And so that's always been part of Redux. That's the standard way to use it. And configure store calls that combine reducers function internally. Now, something people have done over the years is they want to lazily add more slice reducers to the Redux store. And there's documented patterns for doing that, but it takes some manual effort. And there's been third-party packages to help with that, but there had never been anything built into the Redux libraries themselves to help with that process of code splitting or lazily injecting reducers. So maybe like a year and a half ago, Lenz just had a bit of a brainstorm and wrote down an idea for here's something that I think we could add that would help fill that case. And then Ben went and just built it over the course of like a couple weeks, maybe earlier this year. Yeah. And so that ended up in RTK 2.0 as a new feature called Combine Slices. And that should be listed in the migration page.
Yeah, it's in the table of contents.
One little thing to add here, there was always a problem with that pattern of injecting a reducer, and that's that after you injected a reducer, that reducer didn't have state yet. So you always injected a reducer, and then you dispatched an action to trigger the reducer to have it create its first state. And that was a problem with React specifically, if a React component wanted to inject a reducer, because then like you would immediately trigger another render by dispatching that action, and that was causing a lot of bugs for people, and we didn't want that pattern. So essentially we were blocked adding something without finding a workaround for that and finding a way of doing that without having to dispatch that action. And that's the main story and the main thing that we needed to unblock to get this working.
Got it.
So Ben, this is your baby implementation wise. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So Combined Slices was based on the RFC that Lenz put out in October 2022, and I just kind of spent a lot of time getting attached and implementing it all. And because there were some really nice features that I really liked, other than, I mean, as well as the injection, which is the main idea. But I mean, even just looking at it with a basic example, it's got some nice, because it's with Redux Toolkit rather than Redux Core, it can be more opinionated. So it can, what it does is it if you give it a slice or an API instance, it automatically mounts those under its reducer path. You don't have to build the whole object yourself. It will automatically just go, okay, this slice says it needs to go here. And then with the injection story, if you scroll down a bit, I think there's a example of, yeah. So basically you call inject with a slice that you want to inject, and that gets added, and you get a new version of the reducer, which is the same reducer, but it's typed to know that it's got that reducer injected, because by the time this inject call has happened, that reducer is now in the state. And the other thing that's not documented here, but it provides a selector API, because we're not dispatching an action when that reducer, because we're not dispatching that action, the state doesn't appear, but we still want our selector to receive some sort of state. So the selector API, you pass a normal selector to that, and if this state doesn't exist in your Redux store yet, it will call it with the slice's initial state instead. It will just go, okay, here's what the initial state would look like if it was there. It's not going to complain that it can't find it because you're lazy loading and you haven't actually, because it hasn't appeared in state yet.
Yeah,
got it.
So previously, with kind of the earlier handwritten versions of lazy loading and reducers, your code might have needed to account for, well, is this actually added to the store or not? And now we kind of, automatically fill this in to where you use one of the selectors, and even if it isn't actually in the store yet, we still give you back the initial value, and the rest of your code can just say, well, the value will always exist, and keep going.
Mm.
And that simplifies the TypeScript story as well. You don't have to account for all of those optionals and nulls and so on. It just will always be there.
Great. Cool. Okay. Did we want to look at anything else, or should we dive into some code?
Let's see. Maybe a couple other things real fast. So I think the next section down is adding selectors to create slice. We've added a few more options to the create slice method over the years, and
where was it? I was just looking at it.
Yep, up a little further.
Here, selectors.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
Ben, you want to cover this one as well?
Sure. So it's been wanted for a long time, because you define, well, previously in legacy, you would separate them all by file. But what part of the point of slices was saying, these are all very similar linked fields. So what if we just all created them in the same place? So by adding selectors to create slice, you're then, for TypeScript, for example, it knows exactly what your state's going to look like, because it knows what the slice state looks like. It then also can receive different kind of selectors before. So these selectors here are built to receive just the slice state. They're not. So normally you'd write a selector function that receives the entire root state of your global store and it would have to go drill down all the way through that to find where that slice is and then do whatever it wants with it. Whereas with these, because they're slice selectors, they're built to specifically just take that slice state and do what it wants. It doesn't have to worry about the entire root state. You then worry about your root state when you either call get selectors or you just use the preloaded dot selectors, which assumes, and this is something that we specifically are pushing in 2.0, is that slices have a reducer path, which defaults to their name, which is used by combined slices, but also you could manually mount things under their reducer path. That's something that's come with RTK query for a long time. That's had a reducer path function, and that reducer path property, and that's now carried over to slices as well. Slices have an opinion on where they think they should be in the state, and therefore we can use that information for slice.selectors, which is preloaded to go, okay, I'm going to look into the root state under my own reducer path, so you don't even have to worry about giving me a selector to find myself. I know where I'm going to be. So that's kind of built to simplify a lot of cases for you.
Yeah, part of the idea here is that, like each slice reducer is just a function. You could use it anywhere. You could use it with React's use reducer hook if you wanted to. Technically, you could use this as the entire root reducer of a Redux store.
Sure.
But again, like 95% of the time, I'm going to take that counter slice, and you see where we've got the name counter field in there. I'm going to set that up so that it acts as state.counter at the top level of my Redux store. So why should I have to write that, the name counter in 2, 3, 4 different places? If we just sort of assume that you want to do the obvious standard thing as the default, we can reduce a little bit of that duplication and provide some better usage experience out of the box. Just assume that they're going to do the obvious thing, allow them to customize it if necessary, but prefer the obvious default.
Got it. Okay, so there's a question here that I think is relevant. So I'm just gonna ask it now before I forget. But Phil is saying, I find myself writing selectors for every single field in a slice, and what's the recommended approach to avoid this?
The shorter answer is don't. There's actually a usage guide page in the Redux docs that talks about writing selectors, and it talks about what are selectors, what is memoization, when and why and how should I use selectors, what is the reselect library, and it's got a few extra tips and guidelines towards the bottom. If you scroll down under the using Redux section, under logic and patterns, driving data with selectors. And if you open up and if you go to the table of contents section there at the top and expand it, one of the final items should be balance selector usage. And this is one of those kind of like hazy things. There's nothing preventing you from creating a unique selector for every single state.counter.x, state.counter.y, state.counter.the other thing field, but there probably isn't a lot of value in doing that. You can, but you're writing a lot of code, and I'm not sure how much benefit it's going to have. One common mistake that I think people make: you definitely don't need to have memoized selectors if the only thing it's doing is returning a value. Memoized selectors matter if you are deriving new references. So maybe like todos.map and returning the ID, or constructing some kind of a new object. If it's just a lookup, then really the selector can be a basic function. You don't need the reselect library for that. And like in general, I would say, write selectors to get maybe a couple important fields out of the slice. Definitely write selectors if you are deriving new values, but just generally don't feel like you need to write selectors that wrap every single field. There's no real benefit for that.
I think a good way to go about it would be, instead of every time you add a new field, make a selector for that, it would be every time you need to select something out of state, then make a selector for that, because that may not be the same thing.
Got it.
There might also be a little bit of a disconnect here in the question and Mark's answer, because Mark answered mostly about selector functions here. The question is also like writing selectors in general. And even if you just write use selector and you put a function in there that you write inline, that's a selector too. And of course you're going to write a bunch of those, and it can't always completely be avoided. The one big thing that I would say is usually your state should contain pretty raw data, and your selector should derive data. And your component should not like select 5 or 6 values from your store and then calculate something out of it inside the component and work with that. But a selector should already be doing that, calculating that something that your component needs, and then you select that. And that way, of course, sometimes you get to the point where there's like a first name and a last name and an age, and you want to select all 3 and you write 3 selectors, that's okay. But if it's like something more complex where you would have a calculation that you would maybe put into a use memo in your component, that's too late. You shouldn't select 5 values and calculate a use memo over it. You should have one selector, and that selector should already have made that calculation for you. So that might be another way to think about that for a little bit. But if you just need the blank values, then just having 5 selectors is totally fine. But they don't need to be memo selectors. They can also be inline selectors. But that's totally fine then.
Got it.
I mean, it is worth noting that we do advise selectors should be as specific as possible, just because with your use selector hook, you'll when the selector result changes, that will re-render the component regardless of whether you're using how much of that state, So you make sure that the selectors that you write return as little as needed. Essentially, they state.foo.bar, rather than just returning the entire state and then pulling out of that. You be as specific as what you need. So that may end up writing lots of selectors, and that's okay.
Got it. So to maybe put a broad view on this, the goal with selectors and what we're trying to do is we're effectively trying to use selectors as the business logic layer in the application. Like if I need, so the Redux store is raw data. Whatever we would, if we're pulling it out of a database, we'd put it into the Redux store, and that's like the raw stuff. That's what the current state of things is in the UI or whatever it is we're doing. And then what I would historically have done by pulling some of that state and then writing a function inside my component to manipulate that state, that's what would go into a selector, so that what I'm doing is mostly my components are being what React components or any components are supposed to be, which is functions that return state. They don't do business logic. They are not functions that return state, functions that return UI, basically. Like you get some data and you take that data and then you show something on screen based on what data you received. You're not doing the business logic to manipulate data inside of these components.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I maybe said too specific, reducers should not necessarily be your raw data.
Okay.
Reducer should be the most common data your application works with. So if you have some kind of derivation that you would always make after that, and you don't need that raw original value at all, then just throw that original value away and have that pre-calculation going on in the reducer. The thing is that many people start duplicating data inside their reducer. Like I have 5 numbers and then in an array, and then I have a field called sum. And every time I add something, I have to update the array and the sum. And every time I delete something, I have to update the array and the sum. And that means I duplicate logic, and I run the risk that I forget it once and then things run out of sync. So in that case, I would say always just have that array in there, because it's like the common data for all derivation you want to do. And the summing up would be your selector.
Got it.
But if you're never interested in those original values in the first place, and you ever only want to have that sum available, then by all means put that sum in the reducer and don't put extra logic in your selector. So it really depends on what you do. Like if you're interested in that array, if you need to know which items are in there, what the length of the array is, etc., then put the array in there. If you're just interested in the result of the calculation, just put the result of the calculation. But don't do both, because it will run out of sync, because we are human and we write bugs.
Yeah, speaking from experience, I starting out using Redux, I would store so much derived data because I wasn't aware of, deriving in memoized selectors. So then having the epiphany of actually all of this data I could just derive and make somewhere else, and that would be consistent, and my state would be so much smaller by keeping all this data out as well.
Yeah, the React docs, one of the nice things about the new React docs tutorials is they actually give very similar advice. Like the docs page about, like you might not need to use effect, I think. Lists a number of things you can do to avoid effects. One of the common things people did with use effect is I'm going to set state in an effect to try to apply updates coming from props or something like that. And in a lot of cases in React, rather than trying to do a set state all the time, you can just calculate final values in the middle of render. Whether or not it's in a use memo, you just take these values, add them together based on the inputs. And so you're deriving the results as you go. So with Redux and selectors, it's kind of the same thing. You can pre-calculate some of these values. Sometimes and save them. Sometimes it makes sense to do that. But as a general principle, it makes sense to keep more of the original data in state and read and recalculate and derive the results as needed so that it's consistent everywhere it gets used.
Got it. Okay. All right. So the time flew here because we're basically at the end of our episode. So we didn't get a lot of code written, but boy, did we cover a lot of ground. And I'm actually completely okay with that, because I feel like this was, being able to ask these questions directly to the people who are writing the patterns is always very helpful. So for folks who want to get more, we've shared the usage, we've shared the migration. Where else should people go if they want to learn more, dig deeper?
Let's see. So those would be the starting pages. The way we've got the doc sites split is that the Redux core docs have the documentation on actually the core library, which again, people should not be you don't have to install the literal Redux package yourself. That's already included in RTK. But the core documentation site has the overall tutorials and the usage guides that sort of pertain to anything that is like broadly Redux related. And then we have the separate site for Redux Toolkit specifically with the API references and discussions of how to use those specific API methods. We all three of us hang out in the Redux channel in the Reactiflux Discord, and we answer questions. Ben's been doing an awful lot of that lately. And then we also keep an eye on GitHub issues and discussions and some stuff on Twitter.
Got it. We have one more question before I let you go. Is it still safe to use Redux Persist?
Yeah, we think so. Obviously, there's the fact that it's the maintainer store is not really there's not really someone in the position of maintaining it, but it's functional. There isn't anything that's broken. There is a few things there's a few challenges that need, specifically using it with RTK2 or Redux 5. There's a couple of other things that will need tweaks that are very simple to fix. We've got issues open for those.
TypeScript type compatibility mostly.
Yeah, exactly. But it's functional. It's widely used. I use it for a lot of things. It functions. There isn't anything that we're particularly worried about it. And it's, for the moment, I don't think it's something we intend to adopt ourselves, because we think we do enough. We think the Redux Persist pattern is the current ecosystem winner, and I think that's fine. There's a
more recent library called Redux Remember that is an equivalent tool that would do the same kind of job.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, did we actually play with that, or do we only know it exists?
I haven't had a chance to use it myself. I've seen other people try it out, and it looks like it is being actively maintained. So I get the sense that this is a valid alternative, but I can't speak to the results personally.
Yeah, and as an overview, it looks very similar to Redux Persist, so it shouldn't be too alien to anyone previously using Persist.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time today. This was fantastic. And to everybody watching, thanks for hanging out. Please, if you enjoy these shows, please take the time to like the show, subscribe, all those things. I know it's a shameless ask, but it really does help keep the show going. And if you want to get really wild, we've even got stuff that you can get early access to, like content that's only available like a week before it goes public. So if you want to support the show for real, get on here and do this thing. I'll send you a link to it. You can also sub on Twitch. You can join the Discord. You can do all sorts of stuff to help keep Learn with Jason going. So thank you all very much. One more shout out to our captioner. We've got Ashley here from Whitecoat Captioning today. Thank you so much. That's made possible through the support of our sponsors, Netlify and Vetsu Code. So thank you very much for making the show more accessible and possible. While you're checking out things on the site, make sure you take a look at the upcoming schedule, because it is just packed. There's so much good stuff. So next week, we're going to have Jessica Janik on the show. If you saw Mark Texan the week before last, Jessica crashed the show. It was very funny. And she's going to come back and talk about Defer, which is a feature that she helped lead in the Angular code base, along with some other features that are, really making Angular exciting these days. We've got Adam Argyle is coming here to the studio. We're going to shoot live in studio. It's going to be chaos, I imagine, but a lot of fun. So make sure that you are ready for that. And then we've got Steve coming on to talk about Quick and Astro. It's going to be an absolute blast. Lots more as well coming in. Remember, get on the Discord, get on the newsletter, calendar, whatever you want. We got all the ways. So thank you all very much. Mark, Ben, Lenz, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We will see you all next time.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Bye, guys. Thank you for having us.